All right. We're live now for the March 2022 AMA, and I'm starting just a little bit early because I logged in and saw that there's already a lot of questions and comments. So let's get started. Carl Bond, have you ever read any Jacques Barzun? If so, thoughts? If not, ever feel the need to follow up, like, et cetera, et cetera? Yeah, I read Barzun. I started reading him back in graduate school. So we're talking over 20 years ago. And I found him insightful from time to time, but I never like you could say I never bought into his overall project, what I took it to be. I mean, sometimes this is the way it often is with cultural critics. You can agree with them on some things and be like, wow, you totally missed the point of this thing over here. You could say that he's sort of like Neil Postman, or who else comes to mind as somebody who has read very widely. Lionel Trilling. They don't produce a lot of original stuff of their own, but they have a lot to say about what's out there. So yeah, Barzun, not bad. Kind of hit and miss. Johan says, how would Maurice Blondel respond to Jacques Derrida's works and vice versa? Well, I discussed that quite a bit in my dissertation and also in one of my first publications, a book chapter specifically about Blondel and Derrida in Continental Philosophy of Religion. He would probably say, wow, Jacques, you've rediscovered a lot of insights that I've already expressed in my works about reading a work against itself, what Blondel called the method of charity, and also the method of immanence and implication is similar to what Derrida is doing in terms of deconstruction when it's done best, which just goes to show you that Derrida's deconstruction was not something radically new. I doubt Derrida would have an awful lot to say in response to Blondel. It's a question. I mean, he'd probably interestingly and selectively misunderstand what he's saying, right? But I don't picture Derrida. It probably wouldn't be a very interesting back and forth discussion. So. All right, Zach, what draws you to Christianity as opposed to other religions? Been getting into Christianity recently, and I'm wondering about your take. Well, my take is that things aren't even remotely like that. It's not like we kind of well, I think I like this religion better than this religion. No, you study, you practice, you engage, it's impossible to be interested in Christianity as opposed to Buddhism, or pick whatever else you want, unless you're at this extraordinarily high level of generality where nobody actually lives or does anything. I read plenty of stuff outside of Christian authors when it comes to religion, and there's things that I find interesting or attractive about them, and there's many Christians who are billed as such that I consider to be completely noxious, and why the hell would I want to engage with them at all? So things are not quite so simple as you pick one thing or pick another. I'm attracted to thinking things through in terms of these great questions, and in the West, Christianity is certainly one of the main, you could say, communities that thinks through them, but not exclusively. So in a way, this is sort of what we call a category mistake in philosophy, right? Christianity is not really a category as such at this level. Joseph, was Husserl the philosopher that started the use of the word thematic and thematicity in phenomenology? What does it mean for a phenomenon to become thematic? I don't know. I mean, phenomenology doesn't have just one origin. At the time of Husserl, there's also, Maurice Blondel and Bergson, both of whom are clearly doing something like phenomenology, not calling it phenomenology. Max Scheler is just as important early on as Husserl is. And of course, then we get Heidegger coming in. So, and what does it mean for a phenomenon to become thematic? look at which phenomenologist you want to focus on. I mean, the simplest, most general way of saying is we're paying attention to it and focusing on it. Thematize, I think, is often used as sort of a substitute, jargony sounding word for we're now going to systematically look at something. So, I mean, is Husserl the person who originates it? I don't know. You know, it doesn't strike me as something that. I mean, there could be a good article for philosophy and phenomenological research or the Journal of the History of Philosophy in there, but tracing out those origins of terms is not something that I devote a lot of time to. JD Sword, nice to see you here. Seems as though the politics of the Cold War, the latest 80s trend to make a comeback. With the invasion of Ukraine, do you think there's something to the idea that history repeats itself? No, not really. I don't think history repeats itself. I think that isolated dynamics within history often bear a lot of resemblance to each other, but this actually doesn't look like the Cold War to me. Because, I mean, we have an entire political party here in the United States that's basically beholden to our Cold War enemy, the Soviet Union, now Russia, right? The Republicans, for a long time can't say enough about how wonderful Putin and Russia is. And you didn't really see the Democrats doing that if the things flip-flopped during the Cold War. As a matter of fact, that was the thing where Republicans and Democrats more or less came together back in the, say Truman through Reagan / Bush 1 era. And, contemporary Russia, it's interesting. There's been a lot of discussion recently about, well, what if Russia lines up with China and with India against us, And the answer would be, well, if Russia wants to be a penny ante second-rate nation, basically controlled by the Chinese, I guess that, cool for them. Our big geopolitical rival right now is obviously China, not Russia. Russia is unfortunately for its citizens, kind of a bankrupt country, negative population growth, high rates of alcoholism and suicide, clearly, civil societies in a real mess there. So, it's not a great place to be, and it's not offering a model. I mean, here's the thing. When we talk about the Cold War, we had two main models that were being offered: the ostensibly democratic capitalist West and the socialist republics, primarily those in the USSR, and then the Warsaw Pact countries. And then we had a possibility of a third force. Charles de Gaulle tried to organize that idea. What we call the third world meant the non-aligned world. I don't think that we're in that sort of situation now at this point. So I think we're in a different kind of situation. All right. AZ asked, do you think Prince Mushkin and Alyosha were Dostoevsky's final solution? What was he promoting? I don't think there was a final solution in Dostoevsky's works. I actually am convinced by Mikhail Bakhtin's reading of Dostoevsky that views Dostoevsky like Shakespeare as providing us with polyphonic novels, right? Where there is a lot of ethical projects being worked out, but Dostoevsky himself, while he may be definitely against certain things, is not to be identified with any one single character and their perspectives. So I don't think that Dostoevsky has a final solution. He has a very interesting set of problems, and he doesn't just leave them as problems. He lets the characters kind of work them out, both in action and thought and discourse and relationship with each other. So that's a good question. Yeah, I mean, if we were going to have to pick between the two of them, I don't think that that Mushkin, the protagonist of The Idiot, would be it. Alyosha would probably be, a better candidate, but I don't think that that's what Dostoevsky is really up to. So, Mark weighs in. Just wanted to say I placed my order for some Banjo Metaphysics merch today. Excited for the delivery. Here's wishing the new store all the best. Your favorite item you liked making. So Mark is referencing, people have been asking for a long time for merch and a YouTube store. And so I did the work, and it turned out to be an extraordinarily large amount of work, much more than I thought it would be. And I can tell the story about that some other time, all the ins and outs of that. But I do have 3 designs that are available on things like t-shirts and mugs, and in one case a fanny pack, and what else, wall hangings and stuff like that. And so the Banjo Metaphysics, that design is taken from that class that I did back at Marist College over 10 years ago. In an intro to philosophy class, I brought my banjo in to talk about Aristotle's 4 causes, right? And so there's video recording of me at the chalkboard, and I'm holding it and I play it at one point. So I took some screenshots from that and put them in black, in red and yellow and blue and green into a nice square. And I'd say that's actually my favorite design. I thought people might like the idea of I study with Sadler, being able to identify with the channel. So I created something like that. But obviously, I'm not going to wear something like that because I'm the Sadler. I don't study with myself. And then I created something for the half-hour Hegel series, just using the different colors of the video thumbnails. And I'll probably get myself, I can get samples, so I need to get myself some of those, and start wearing them around to the gym. They say if you do an AMA when people are seeing you in a shirt, it's more likely to sell and stuff like that. So, but I'm doing this whole merch thing in an experimental and quirky way. I'm not following the best practices and rules because I kind of just want to do it my way. I want to create some designs and see if people like them and respond to them. And if they do, I'll create some more. If they don't, nothing really lost. It's not like I had to buy a whole bunch of t-shirts and then ship them out or something. So we'll see what happens. But yeah, I'm glad you got one, Mark. That's cool. I mean, people are going to be looking at it and be like, what the hell is that? All right, Galen, I'm not sure if Adam Smith is in your repertoire, but do you agree we can't properly understand Wealth of Nations unless we read it in light of what he says in Theory of Moral Sentiments? Yeah, I mean, I've been teaching Smith for quite a long time, mostly in business ethics classes, and I would actually say 2 things. The first thing is, yeah, if you want to understand Wealth of Nations properly, read the other big book, Theory of Moral Sentiments. That's important. But I would say that the biggest problem is that most people reading the Wealth of Nations read it inattentively because they come in already primed to find capitalism there and a defense of it. And if you read the book carefully, even if you put aside the Theory of Moral Sentiments, Smith is closer to Marx than he is to contemporary capitalists, because he's clear about the dangers of monopolies, for example, and cartels, and the sort of gains that are made within the workshop don't necessarily translate into industrial capitalism the way that people think. And he's very, very clear about the need to avoid the corrosive moral effects that capitalist actions and society and mindsets can lead to. I mean, Smith thinks that people need to actually be virtuous, not just call themselves virtuous. And I mean, he would be pretty condemnatory and critical of a lot of what goes on under his name in the present. So I think there's a lot of readers who they come, they'll get it through Liberty Fund or something like that. And they're already, primed to read Smith as providing the arguments for capitalism, when it's a much more nuanced book than that, So quite important. Ozymandias, how are you? Hope you're doing well. I was wondering if you think there's any contemporary Christian philosophy you find compelling, any particular writers who come to mind. Contemporary Christian thinkers that are still doing philosophy. Yeah, Lester MacIntyre, pretty famous convert. Um, I mean, he and I don't see eye to eye necessarily on the problem of Christian philosophy, which I got to, present to him and talk with him about back when I was doing that seminar. Um, but yeah, I mean, he'd be one. I mean, who else? I mean, I know some contemporary philosophers who are Christians, but I don't know that they bill themselves as Christian philosophers. Um, a lot of us are working in the history of philosophy, and we're not just working exclusively on like I'm an Augustinian or something like that, but sort of contextualizing ancient philosophy and Christianity, or thinking about early modern stuff, and how it may be applicable. Um, I mean, I've met Jean-Luc Marion. I'm not a huge fan of his stuff. Quite frankly, I think that there's some interesting insights, but I think that he throws out way too much baby with the bathwater because he buys into this, Heideggerian / Derridian, critique of metaphysics thing that is kind of unnecessary and misleading. Um, I don't know about. I mean, I don't move too much in uh, Christian philosophical circles. I mean, I'm not moving in any circles right now other than virtually. So I don't really know. It's a good question. Um, Victor, I enjoyed reading your classical metal class. I was wondering, do you enjoy alternative metal like Deftones, Tool, or perhaps Alice in Chains as well? Yeah, I mean, in the 1990s, I mean, you can call it alternative metal. We just called it metal back then. You know, there were a lot of interesting things going on. In the 90s, I was more listening to bands like Tool and Alice in Chains than I was to the classic metal stuff. By the mid 90s, right? Early 90s, I was still doing a lot of that. And I also got, pretty heavily into grunge. I mean, I got myself a bass and I was playing, never got into a band that actually went anywhere, but we were playing a lot of, Stone Temple Pilots and Pearl Jam and Nirvana and stuff like that. Um, as well as, continuing to play Sabbath and Motorhead and Iron Maiden. And so, yeah, I got into that. I also got into prong, and these weird time signatures. And I still do listen to some of that, early, mid, late 90s stuff, which I consider to be quite good. I didn't go into too many other directions that metal was going at the time. Like I didn't get into the genres like death or black or folk or things like that. I mean, another band that really is alternative metal, that was a little bit earlier, Faith No More. They were quite interesting, and yeah, we would get into that. We wanted to stay. I guess you could say that we wanted to stay on top of like heavy music that we could relate to. So bands like the Breeders, for example, or PJ Harvey. Um, there's a heaviness to their music, right? That's continuing on. You could say the project of metal in a very broad sense. And if I had the opportunity to go see them at shows, I probably would. So yeah, good question there. Um, Philip asks, how do you understand Alistair MacIntyre's opposition to Kant's groundwork of the metaphysics of morals? Is he criticizing its limitations to support a collective society, socially agreed upon morality? I mean, MacIntyre is not criticizing Kant's groundwork for the metaphysics of morals. He's criticizing Kant's moral project overall, which includes the second critique and the actual metaphysics of morals and the religion within the limits of reason alone, and a number of other works as well, which would include some of the occasional essays like Perpetual Peace or What is Enlightenment. he's not taking the groundwork as like the single best example of Kant's work throughout MacIntyre's work. And after Virtue, you see him talking about Kantianism and Kant, but he's also, broadening. He takes Kant as sort of like the prototypical deontologist concerned with principles and rules and, all of that sort of approach. And MacIntyre is never somebody to throw things out, right? He's clearly a dialectical Aristotelian philosopher, even before after Virtue, when he's still in his sort of Marxist phase, right? No big surprise, Marx is very Aristotelian, actually. And he wants to say, okay, what can we actually get from this? And then where are the inadequacies of this sort of approach? And it's not just about having a collective socially agreed upon morality. I mean, I don't think that's really what MacIntyre's project is. If you read the After Virtue and then you read the rest of the quadrilogy attentively, there never, ever, ever was a collectively socially agreed upon morality. There's always been rival moralities, and they've always been sort of like over a perpetual, we could say, churning abyss of purely transactional morality that's been going on. So I don't think that I don't think you want to look at it in quite so schematic a way, what MacIntyre's doing. But his basic idea on Kant is that Kant can't provide us with what we actually need, although there are plenty of people who endorse a sort of, low-level Kantian approach to things. And I think he's, that take is basically correct. He also thinks that, sooner or later, you're going to have some people who are basically utilitarians as well in the mix. And some, changes the name from emotivist to expressivist. You've used a lot of existentialist philosophies fitting in there. There's going to be some like that. And there's also going to be some fake Aristotelians in the mix as well that you have to deal with, right? So Profom, you mentioned that you like Alistair MacIntyre. You don't agree with everything he says. I mean, MacIntyre himself would probably not like a MacIntyrean who agrees with everything he says, just by the very nature of MacIntyre's philosophy and the way he understands how to do moral theory. Is there anything in particular you disagree with? Yeah, I've talked about this in a number of AMAs because this question has been asked a number of times. He gets, some of his history of philosophy wrong. I've actually you can find the video out there. I presented a paper at the International Society of MacIntyrean Inquiry years back where I said MacIntyre got Anselm wrong. And here's what he could have, if he looked at these texts of Anselm, here's what he could have seen. And this would have actually have strengthened his position. But instead, he basically ignored or dismissed Anselm in favor of a more Thomistic oriented history. We know he got the Stoics wrong. Anthony Long wrote a amazing piece years and years and years back, basically saying, listen, Alistair, this stuff that you're saying about the Stoics, you got them wrong. And they would have been a very similar rival tradition to what you're, pitching as this Aristotelian tradition. It's got all the moving parts that you're looking for. And I would actually go so far as to say that Neoplatonism offers us a similar thing as well. He got Kierkegaard wrong in certain respects, to the degree that Kierkegaard scholars actually authored a collected volume of essays criticizing MacIntyre, to which MacIntyre himself responded, right? So there's a lot of getting things wrong in terms of history. That's probably enough at this point. I will actually say one other thing. So MacIntyre, back in the Bush versus Kerry campaign, Alistair MacIntyre and Paul Griffiths both authored pieces basically saying, if you're a faithful Catholic, you can't vote for the Republicans or the Democrats. And there was a lot of like, well, you can't vote for the Democrats because of abortion. And then Griffiths and MacIntyre were like, well, you can't vote for these Republicans either. And remember, this is like before the Tea Party, before the Trump craziness, before the slide into, fascism and craziness and all that sort of stuff. This is back in 2004. I didn't find that convincing because a principled non-vote just goes into the same hopper as all the other non-votes, a sort of no register, and I don't think that's particularly helpful. So that was another thing as well. All right, a lot of MacIntyre stuff, interestingly here. I'm not quite sure what that is about, but let's see here. Cinder, you mentioned somewhere that MacIntyre in some ways gets Foucault wrong. In what ways do you think he did, and what could he have done better? Okay, so I mean, anybody can do better by paying closer attention and devoting more time and thought to what they're responding to. I mean, I think that Foucault is he is doing a genealogical project. I don't see MacIntyre taking account of the shift after the genealogical project to what's going on in the history of sexuality. Foucault is a fairly careful assembler, let's say, of historical evidence. I mean, he's clearly telling a story that sometimes you can say, yeah, that's probably true. In other cases, you could be like, oh, I'm not really sure about that, especially if you know the material that Foucault is working with. But you can say that about just about any interpretation of history. As a matter of fact, anybody who thinks that history is easy and straightforward, they're not working with history, right? They're working with something else instead. I mean, one of the things I should say, MacIntyre, when he arranges these three rival versions of moral inquiry, and that's the name of one of the books, the third book in the quadrilogy, right? So you got Enlightenment or Encyclopedia, you've got genealogy, right? And then you've got tradition-constituted rationality. Tradition-constituted rationality is only worth a crap when it actually engages with these other two things, right? And doesn't just dismiss them. It's not doing the Benedict option a la Rod Dreher's crappy misconstrual of it. That MacIntyre, by the way, has had a lot to say about. Just Google MacIntyre Benedict option and you'll see him ripping Dreher apart on this. But a lot of people like to use MacIntyre as kind of a call for that isolative thing, whereas MacIntyre isn't for that at all, So I would say, insofar as genealogy can sometimes be written off, I'm not going to say MacIntyre is making that mistake. I'll say readers of MacIntyre are making that mistake. Retro Gamer, thanks for providing the Hegel video index, helpful in many ways to study and return to enjoy the text. Yeah, so last night on Medium, I took the stuff that I had previously on the Half Hour Hegel blog, where I had like pages and pages of links to the videos organized according to the table of contents of the Phenomenology, which I just happen to have here. So you can see there's some real structure, right? And the reason why I wanted to create a list that reflected that structure is because YouTube, you can create a playlist, right? And there is still a Half Hour Hegel playlist, but the trouble is it's organized sequentially. So each video follows the next, but that doesn't give you like, okay, I want to go to, this particular section of spirit. Let's pick something at random. All right, I need to look at culture and its realm of actuality. Okay, so that is self-alienated spirit, culture, which is the B section, and this is in section 1 of that. Well, you can go to the curated list and you can scroll down, and you can find it right away, right? So I think that's quite helpful for people, especially if they're going to use it as a study aid, just going to certain sections of the phenomenology. I don't understand why YouTube doesn't do better playlists. I mean, I hadn't really thought about this at the time, but your comment makes me think about that. What would it cost them to allow us to do, a little bit of nesting or organization in it? I'm sure it couldn't be that difficult to code, but they don't seem to have any interest in that. And it's not like anybody out there in YouTube in the company is really listening to any of us. So unless we get like 1 million people to sign a petition or something like that. So, all right. Marcos asks, is this live? I mean, it's a live stream, so yeah, that's kind of trivially true, right? Lapse continuum. Is it possible that truth itself, not just knowledge, might be partial or come in degrees? Absolutely. I mean, that's sort of you're asking sort of, is it possible for water to be wet? Yeah. I mean, is it possible for us to drink water? Sure. I mean, who's out there preaching that truth is either like totally true or totally false, or doesn't come in degrees? Does the question make sense? Yeah, it makes sense, but it's one of those things where I think unless somebody's got an extraordinarily weird view on truth, which of course you can ask, well, how true is this? And then you're doing degrees with them, right? It seems kind of like a non-starter to me. I mean, I will say this: people in rhetorical situations, and not just rhetorical, but heuristic rhetorical situations where they're trying to, disprove the other person and make their side the only winner, they will often say stuff like, well, if you lied once, you're totally a liar and we don't trust anything you say. But that's such bullshit, that can't possibly work for us as human beings, right? Muhammad Terrence, I am human. I think nothing human is alien to me. How do you see invasion of Ukraine and other maddening stuff? Do you see a light at the end of the tunnel for humanity? Why or why not? I mean, when in history has there not been maddening stuff like this? I mean, just think about Putin himself. If you're maddened by the invasion of Ukraine, why not be maddened about the Chechen war or the Russian, support of the Assad regime and its horrible, horrible things that it's been doing to its own people for years and years? Or, I mean, this is not something. The Ukraine thing is not something radically new, right? I mean, I'm going to say something, and this may bother some people. I remember back in graduate school, it was kind of a big thing to talk about the Holocaust all the time, right? And clearly the Holocaust happened, and it happened to a lot of people, but Jews were certainly at the center of it, and clearly ideologically that was a main point of the Holocaust. And I remember my mentor, Garth Gillen, in class one day saying, the Holocaust is uniquely terrible and all that sort of stuff. And I was like, you're full of crap. I mean, the Rwandan genocide, which also is driven by some of these same fascist ideology stuff, if you actually look into what was going on, the propaganda that was being used by the Hutus against the Tutsis, some of it derives from, colonial realms and all that. There's like a whole argument to be put there. I was like, it's not as big, but, somebody killed in that genocide is just as dead as somebody in another genocide, aren't they? And do you think it matters that it was oriented by Nazism or by this ideology? And I think you can say the same thing for what happens in criminality and in wars and violence and bad policing and all sorts of things. There's lots and lots of evil in the world. Sure, nobody's really debating that. It's just that we're now seeing some of it being thrown in our face a little bit more. I don't have a problem living in a world in which things are messed up because I don't expect the world to be radically different than it is. And I have hope for humanity all the time because the world isn't just the crappy parts, right? And even the crappy parts, we can say, well, look at the heroic actions of these Ukrainians, or we can say, wow, extending mercy to a soldier who doesn't want to be there and surrenders, and instead of like kicking his teeth in and saying, die Russian scum, giving him some food, that's an act of hospitality right there. That's also equally humanity, right? So this is for me not that big of an issue, and it doesn't mean that we don't get upset about things, or oppose injustice, but it doesn't have to cripple us and turn us into despairs, you could say. All right, Gavin says, I'm a beginner in this stuff and devour your fantastic vids on Plato, going through them all for my next steps. Any thoughts on doing your home study Aristotle course versus worldviews course? So he's mentioning two things that I have in my Reason IO Academy. I have a worldviews and values course that I taught at Marist College and developed a bunch of resources for. And so when I quit teaching for Marist, I was like, well, maybe people would want to go through this and see what was in an academic course. So I put it there in my Teachable Academy and charged pretty low price for it. I like to keep things as affordable as possible so that more people can have access to them. And then the Aristotle course is Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. And the answer is you can do either. I mean, I don't have advice about which one you ought to do. That's up to you. You should look at what they're covering, and the worldviews and values course, remembering off the top of my head, covered some parts of Plato's Republic, some Epictetus, some Boethius, well, the whole of the Consolation of Philosophy, Rene Descartes' discourse on method, Thomas Hobbes' bits of the Leviathan, Mary Wollstonecraft, parts of Vindication of the Rights of Women, Jean-Jacques Rousseau's discourse on the origins of inequality, Marx, Alienated Labor and the Communist Manifesto, and then Martin Luther King's Letter from a Birmingham Jail and I Have a Dream. And I don't think I'm leaving anybody out in that. So if that's your game, if that sounds interesting to you, then you can take that, right? If you would rather continue things, more chronologically, then Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics is certainly a great text to look at, and I've got videos covering the entirety of it. So either's fine, I would say. Is it Erkes? Hello, how do you view Kant-Nietzsche dichotomy and contemporary philosophical themes, especially between Rawls and adversaries? Do you see it as a necessary dichotomy? I don't even see it as a dichotomy, because a dichotomy would be like everything falls on one side or the other. So Kant has some ideas. It takes a bit of work to apply them to political philosophy, right? Even though he does have some political philosophy, but you got to do some stretching to get there. Nietzsche, what is his political philosophy? Ask 20 Nietzscheans, get 22 answers, right? So I don't know that that's going to really work, because you don't even have a coherent thing that's the Nietzschean response, and how these are connected with Rawls and his adversaries. I don't see connections between all of these sorts of things. I mean, you can say that Rawls is kind of Kantian in some respects, right? But that's about as good as I think you can get. Richard Santos, what's a good path to follow in order to build a strong philosophy background? I'd like to build on a sound foundation that will give me the ability to better access different thought. Well, reading philosophy, studying philosophers that we acknowledge as clearly having something, interesting and useful to say. I mean, you don't have to study everybody, because you can't, which is a big problem in itself. You probably couldn't even do so back in Hegel's time, but you definitely can't do so today. So, I would say, at least at the beginning, stick with people who you respect are like, yeah, you got to read some Plato, you got to read some Aristotle, you should probably read some of the Stoics. Here's some Seneca. Don't just read Marcus Aurelius the way that the tech bros and kind of Stoic posers do. Actually, read more hardcore Stoic texts. Can't read much Epicurus because we don't have much Epicurus, unfortunately. But you can read Lucretius's on the nature of things, edited by Cicero, we think most likely, by the way. And you can go through the progression. You can be like, well, I heard bad things about Descartes, but I know he's important. And as you're approaching each of these, you should think, what can I get from them? I don't need to become a Cartesian to read Descartes. And the end product of reading Descartes doesn't have to be me becoming a Cartesian, but I should know what he has to say, so that when somebody comes along and criticizes Cartesian dualism, I can say, well, this person knows what they're talking about, or they've just read a few encyclopedia entries on it. They don't know what they're talking about, and here's what my response would be. So that I'd say that can be helpful. I've got some, not enough of them, of course, but I've got some videos on self-directed study that are in a playlist that might be helpful for you. I need to start doing more of those, and also a few other things about self-directed study. All right, your average French something. Recently, an E. coli bacteria was made with human-made DNA. Let's say we exactly copy-pasted the genome of a fertilized human egg and provided enough nutrients. Did we create the same human, or not merely copied nature's framework? Will we become gods? Is there an ethical or metaphysical implication of molecular biology breaking the sacred halo of birth and death? This sort of thing's been going on for a while, right? And will we become gods? It depends on what you mean by becoming gods. That's a pretty vague notion. So you want to be clear about what you mean by that. We're doing all sorts of stuff with manipulating DNA, and it raises some interesting questions. Did we create the same human? I don't think that cloning is really just simply replicating a human. We can talk about replicating, the DNA, but am I just my DNA? A similar problem on the other end about like consciousness. You upload my consciousness a la sci-fi into a computer, and then you put it into a new meat machine. Is it the same guy? Who knows? All of these are really more pragmatic questions, where you got to say, well, it depends on what you mean by same, right? And this is where philosophy, I think, can be very helpful, because philosophers are good at making distinctions and making it clear why distinctions, how they apply, right? All right, Abhishek, you have no video made of Indian thinkers. Yeah, no shit. You're not pointing out something to me I don't know. I've talked about this many, 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 many times. Usually it's phrased more like, why don't you have videos on Indian thinkers? Because I'm not a specialist in Indian philosophy, and I don't read Sanskrit or Hindi or Pali, for that matter. And I tend to stick to the stuff that I'm good at and leave the vast world of the internet to the millions of other people who could do better videos than me on that material. Why should I do stuff on Indian philosophy or Islamic philosophy or Chinese philosophy when there's better people to do it? And there's plenty of people out there already doing it. People bring this up as if it's like, I'm supposed to do everything. I'm not even doing everything in Western philosophy. So why would I, turn to something that's got a just as long of a backstory and a massive, massive number of texts, and not do the work that I'm doing over here to do a little bit of dabbling and dilettantism over here? It seems kind of a bad use of my time, and it's probably going to produce videos that are not as good as what other people could produce, right? All right, Huey, what was the first philosophy book that had a tremendous impact on your perspective? While you're on it, what's your morning routine? I mean, totally unconnected. My morning routine is wake up, have some coffee, and then see what the day holds. I don't do a lot of routines and stuff like that. I'm not. There's a lot of people that are into that sort of stuff. Like, I got to begin my day with my affirmations. I did that sort of stuff. I'm not. That works for some people. I'm not into that. So, first philosophy book that had a tremendous impact on my perspective. That's a good question. I mean, I read Camus' Myth of Sisyphus. That's the first philosophy book I had, but I didn't understand most of what I was reading. That was back in high school. And I kind of read passages and selections, but reading like a whole philosophy book. So, this is going to sound weird, I think, to a lot of people. But it probably was Sartre's Being and Nothingness, which I started reading in a serious way my sophomore year of college, reading on my own, and I again didn't understand everything I was reading, maybe 50% of what I was reading, but it did have a big impact on me. I went through a Sartrean phase, and I got really into existentialism. So I would say that's probably it. Messack, who do you consider first and second rate thinkers? I mean, that could be like an entire long video. Plato's a first rate thinker, Seneca's a first rate thinker, Cicero's a first rate thinker. As a matter of fact, there's quite a few first rate thinkers in the ancient world. I would say, we jump to the present. MacIntyre is a first rate thinker. Julia Annas is a first rate thinker. Chris Gill, Anthony Long, these sort of people. A lot of the second rate thinkers, or maybe even like third or fourth, fifth rate rank thinkers, are the people that we look at as gurus today. The Jordan Petersons and Sam Harris's and Nassim Taleb's and people like that have big followings, but nobody's going to be reading their crap 100 years from now. They're just going to be footnotes in other people's books, sort of like Herbert Spencer, right? Who reads Herbert Spencer today? Not too many people, but he was a big deal back in his day. I don't know. It often depends on how good is the engagement of other people's ideas, and then what about the development of your own ideas? Ridicule, thoughts on, I'm not even going to try to pronounce his name, and flow states. His work has apparently influenced Julia Annis's conception of virtuous activity. I don't know. I haven't seen that. I'd have to check it out. I think that the flow state stuff is, it could be interesting. People make way, way, way too much of this sort of thing. And I haven't read his work, so I don't know how rigorous it is, or whether he's, making a lot of, silly, easy to make mistakes or stuff like that. So, Huey, have you read Infinite Jest before? What do you think about David Foster Wallace, its author? I'm not interested in David Foster Wallace. Again, somebody who I think is going to be pretty much ignored 100 years from now, whereas, Ursula K. Le Guin and Philip K. Dick will be read hundreds of years from now. I'm not going to waste the time to read Infinite Jest when I have so many other great things I can be reading. Seems to me that most of the people that I run into who are big on it tend to be, they're not very interested in other things that I find interesting. I've read a few essays by David Foster Wallace, enough to be like, I don't get what the hype is about, and that's basically all I have to do. I'm going to say something here to the rest of you. You don't have to feel like you have to read anybody just because other people are into them. it's your life, it's your brain, it's your time. I mean, obviously, if you're assigned to work in class, you should read that because you're part of that class, right? Or you join a reading group, you should read the book that you're reading. But just because somebody has some temporary prestige doesn't mean that we need to go read them. I mean, if they last a long time, we might say, oh, people are still into this years and years later. Maybe I'll go back and check it out. Like, I recently, read Virginia Woolf, A Room of Her Own. And I'm like, yeah, that's pretty good stuff. I can kind of see where people are getting into her from, So, yeah, you get to decide what you want to read. Dan, did you ever deal with feelings of doubt in your abilities as a philosopher? Oh, yeah. I mean, all of us do. All of us do, except for nut jobs who think that they're like God's gift to the world, right? There's a lot of things that you can go through. I've mentioned a couple times here that you can't read everything, right? So you can walk into a good research library, and you, like, for example, when I was at Southern Illinois University, we had an amazing research library, surprisingly good. But that was a product of Delete Morris and his university building that went on. And, when I go to the Marquette Rayner Library, it's good. It's not great, but there's still, you walk down a hall full of books on, the history of philosophy or literature. And you're like, oh man, I'm never going to read all this crap. And even if I do, I'm not going to remember 3/4 of what I read. Oh, what am I going to do? And that can, it can make you feel bad about yourself and your prospects and all of that. But it doesn't have to, and you can also think about, you can easily succumb to the stratified prestige system. Oh, that guy's from Harvard, he must be smart. No, there's a bunch of dummies at Harvard, just like there are everywhere else, right? Some people are only there because they kissed the right asses, or because they knew the right people, or because it was convenient for others that they be there, right? The proportion between like great thinkers and duds and people in between is pretty much the same anywhere you go. But you look at how things work in the profession, and that could kind of get you down, right? Could make you feel bad because maybe your work won't get published because you don't have some big name person pushing it to the academic press. Then again, you want to publish a work, hell, you can do it on Amazon these days, right? So there's lots of ways of dealing with these things. And I guess you could say the thing to do is to talk to other people, right? Get other people's perspectives, and to think it through, question your assumptions. Oh, I'll never get published. How do you know that? Research what it takes to get published. There's lots of ways we can approach these matters. So, and the other thing to keep in mind is philosophy is difficult, right? So you can't be an expert in everything. If you are devoting your time to understanding Aristotle, maybe that requires the rest of your life. And that's okay, because that's worthwhile. If that means that you don't understand Nietzsche, how's that damaging the world or you or anything like that? People won't necessarily expect you to study and talk about Nietzsche, right? I mean, so long as you can, when you're teaching undergrads, expose them competently to some ideas, right? Not get Nietzsche completely wrong in the classroom, you probably are doing good work. You're opening up minds. You never know too what it's actually going to bear fruit in, right? Students will contact you 10 years down the line and be like, oh, remember that I didn't talk in class. I got something out of your class, right? So, all right, NL, some say Deleuze is anti-Hegelian. Reading Zizek's more theoretical work, I find Deleuze and Zizek's Hegel quite alike. Can we deal with differences in Hegelian as a signifier historically? Kojev, I don't know what the last part means there, but I mean, again, super high level of generality that probably doesn't mean an awful lot of stuff. I mean, Deleuze is explicitly anti-Hegelian. He says he's anti-Hegelian. One of the best places to see that is in his Nietzsche book, right? Which is a great book, by the way. I actually like it quite a bit. Zizek and Deleuze, if you're seeing like, the two of them coming together, you're probably misreading both of them, because there's a lot of differences between them, and you could compare them against each other. And it would be weird to find two big thinkers like coinciding anyway. But you got to ask yourself, well, what does anti-Hegelian mean? What is being rejected coming from Hegel? Because, you could call me an anti-Hegelian because I think that, history did not end with the end of this book, right? So that's anti-Hegelian, isn't it? End of history didn't happen in 1807 or, whatever other arbitrary date we want to pick. I think that Hegel's self-imposed demand that the system be finished by the time that he starts writing about it as an epistemological requirement is he doesn't have to do that. It's kind of irrational for him to do that. Am I an anti-Hegelian because of that? It really depends. Sort of like the thing I made, the remark I made earlier. When it comes to these big level, high level abstractions, we got to be really pragmatic about it. We got to say, what does this actually mean to us? Otherwise, we're just kind of playing around with words. And, that can be fun, but it's not getting us anywhere. Ridicule. Currently on my first read of Aristotle's Politics, what in the world is he talking about when he says gymnastic exercises are a manner in which oligarchies deceive the people? I don't know. That doesn't come to mind for me right off the bat, and I wouldn't worry too much about it. Gymnastic exercises encompasses everything that has to do with the body. Maybe what he's saying there is it's a way for the oligarchs to keep the people busy so that they're not paying attention to development of their mind. I mean, that could actually, if we look at it this way, we could think about the fitness industry here in the United States and the supplement industry and all of that kind of stuff. I'm reminded of the one time that I did listen to the Alex Jones show as I was driving, in the countryside back from an engagement. I was like, well, I should check this out and see what it is. And I was amazed, like, just how much of the show was devoted to him hawking his supplements. And I was like, who's so stupid as to buy this crap? Well, his listeners, right? Not quite exactly the same thing as oligarchy, right? But kind of along the same line. Censored Anon, do you think Kierkegaard and Nietzsche are similar in more ways than being just existentialist philosophers? Yeah, I mean, they can't be similar. They can't be existentialist philosophers if they're not similar in other ways than just being called existentialist philosophers. I mean, both of them are, reacting against the modes of thought of their time and stressing the importance of the individual and, the importance of affects. And we could go down the line about it, right? And there's also some important differences. And by the way, people were already noting that in Hegel's time. If you Google Georg Brandes, who is a important Danish writer, he noted the similarities not just between Kierkegaard and Nietzsche, but also Dostoevsky and Nietzsche, and suggested that Nietzsche read both of them, which Nietzsche did with Dostoevsky, calling him a great psychologist, and didn't apparently do with Kierkegaard. But people were already noting the similarities at the time. Somebody else who I would say is connecting the dots, Miguel de Unamuno. Later on, Lev Shestov, of course, Karl Jaspers, early on in the 20th century. There's a lot of points of confluence. That's part of why we can actually talk about an existentialist movement in philosophy. Bill says, a friend of mine currently studies philosophy. I'm looking to get into it. He gave me Descartes' Meditations and some Plato. Are these good for an introduction? Also, what is clean room philosophy? I don't know what clean room philosophy refers to off the top of my head, but I'll just say this. There's like millions of terms out there that you can find where somebody's labeled some philosophy thing that's a fad at the time, something that is worth doing. Descartes is definitely worth reading. Plato's definitely worth reading. Expect to reread and reread and reread. Don't expect to get it all right off the bat. As a matter of fact, you can say that about any great philosopher, and you can also say that, by the way, about great literature, right? Don't expect to get it all the first time around. And I often start people off with Plato. I don't know. I would start them off with Descartes. I usually bring him in later, but I've seen people do that for their intro to philosophy classes. It doesn't seem that productive to me, but I guess you could do that. So, Kyle, what did Nietzsche get right? Well, I mean, I think he's right about the workings of ressentiment in part. Max Scheler has a really great book, sort of taking Nietzsche's ideas, criticizing them where they need criticizing, and then going further with the ressentiment idea. I think a lot of people are driven by ressentiment, frankly. Back in, say, 2000, I would say there's probably more people that were on the left that were driven by ressentiment. Now I would say most of the right is like clearly caught up within ressentiment. Nietzsche would, have nothing to do with those people. The idea of the will to power and the self as being considerably more fictional and fragmented than we give it credit for being. I think those are certainly interesting ideas that strike me as being pretty plausible. I think there's a lot of his ideas that are useful in part more for what they're criticizing than for what they're advancing. So, Mutan, how do you read books? Do you ask yourself many questions, or you just try to read through it as fast as possible? You should never, ever try to read through a book as fast as possible. As a matter of fact, this whole idea of speed reading, I think is, if you're going to do philosophy, just put that out of your mind. You don't master philosophical works. You get exposed to them and you get to know them just like you would a person. You don't master people, right? And put them in your pocket and you're like, oh, I've done Joe and I don't have to talk with him anymore. Put all that speed reading bullshit to the side. And anybody who's like competing with you about how many books they've mastered or read, ignore them, right? I just read books. I don't have useful advice for people unless I like sit down and really think about, okay, what are the things that you got to watch out for in this? And this is like in those self-guided or self-directed study videos. I've been reading since I was 3 years old. So it's sort of like asking a fish, how do you swim? I don't do a lot of taking notes or underlining. I never have in my life, I did a bit of that in graduate school, never really got into that. Occasionally, if I think something is really important, I'll like maybe dog ear a page, but different people read different ways. You don't have to feel like you should read in a particular way other than like, respecting the book, saying this is going to be some work and I need to be open to it and continually work on it, right? Yorick, what do you make of the counter argument against Nietzsche that people can't create their own values? Depends on what you mean by create your own values. Again, we got to be clear. We got to clarify what we mean. People create their own values all the time. Unless maybe you mean that they can't create something that nobody else has ever created in the history of mankind. Yeah, sure. That's true. Trivially true. But people do create their own values. People select between ranges of values. People prioritize. So I don't see that as a real objection. Hytham, what is your all-time favorite band? So if you asked me 30 years ago, or maybe even longer, I would have said Iron Maiden. I don't have a favorite band. I have sort of a constellation of great bands that I love, some of whom are metal, some of whom aren't. And, they kind of shift position every once in a while. Many of them are metal. So Dio, Motorhead, Black Sabbath in its many iterations, Judas Priest, Rat, those are a Tank. Those are among my favorite bands. Saxon, Raven, Girl School, Rock Goddess. I really like them as well. But there's other bands in there as well, like that might surprise you, like Duran Duran. I'm a huge Duran Duran fan, or New Model Army, or our local Violent Femmes, or like I mentioned earlier, PJ Harvey. I really like her stuff. So I don't really have a favorite, Um, Butterdog, best way to read Kant. There is no best way to read Kant. There's no best way to read anybody. It really depends on what you're trying to read and what you're doing with it. Philip, what's your opinion about Lvov, Warsaw Philosophy School? Don't know it, so there's nothing I can say about it. Peter says, can anything be a form? For example, is something as recently made up and stupid as NFTs a form? Is there a form of NFT? Depends on what you mean by form. Plato's forms, Aristotle's forms, other kinds of forms, right? There isn't a single conception of form. And you will find already in the Parmenides that Socrates, who's talking with Parmenides, says that there isn't a form for any kind of thing. There isn't a form for mud, for example. So it's kind of a non-starter. All right. Just skipped a little bit here. Let me scroll back up so I can get to where. Okay, Chris, any thoughts on Viktor Frankl and his book, Man's Search for Meaning, his concept of logotherapy? He seems to have been writing in the existentialism field. He's in existentialism very solidly. He has another book that's better, more interesting about, I think it's called Psychotherapy and Existentialism. Man's Search for Meaning, it's okay. He was really surprised, as he writes in his other books, that one took off so much, because it's Frankl light, right? His other books are more serious, more rigorous. There's more to get out of it. He's doing an interesting form of psychotherapy that is certainly informed by his experiences and by existentialism and by, thinking things out in the traditional big tent Freudian camp and doing other things as well. I enjoy reading Viktor Frankl. I think that some people who get into Viktor Frankl are a little bit too exclusively into Viktor Frankl. I think he's somebody who's better read along with other people, right? But there's people who are interested in that. MF, speaking of MacIntyre, what book of his should I start reading first, and what philosophers do I need to read or reread before? Why do it before? Why not read in conjunction? After Virtue probably is the place to start, because that's the beginning of a 4-book series that you can certainly get a lot out of, and nothing will stop you from actually, as you're reading his discussion of Plato, going back and reading the text that he's talking about. So, after Virtue, and then there's Whose Justice, Which Rationality, and then 3 rival versions of moral inquiry, and then Dependent Rational Animals. That's going to keep you busy for a while. There's earlier books like Against the Self-Images of the Age, which is really awesome. And, he's got there's a great book that he's got called The Unconscious that came out of a class that he was teaching way, way back in the day. But you can jump in basically wherever you want to, So, all right. Bill, do you think Hume's problem of induction and is-ought problem can be solved? Well, there is no problem of induction in Hume because he doesn't call it that. And there is no is-ought problem in Hume because he doesn't call it that. That's what scholars later on reconstituted as. You should read Hume, right? The answers are there in Hume. And the is-ought thing, if you actually read the text, you're going to find that what the point that Hume is making is not that we can never derive an is from an ought. Oh, don't ever do that sort of thing. It's just that we have a whole bunch of oughts in in our background that we're thinking of all the time. It's a much more trivial point than a lot of people have made of it. And Hume effectively deals with the problem of induction, this big thing, read the inquiry. I mean, by the time you get to the end of it, Hume is making sweeping claims like, human nature is basically the same across time. That's why we can actually know reliably that the person is not going to get out of jail. There's a lot of nonsense and silliness that has been made by people in the history of philosophy and in writing introductory textbooks about what exactly Hume is saying. So I would actually go to the Hume. Richard Santos, thoughts on Joseph Pieper, Jacques Maritain, and Peter Kreeft. The only one of those that I've given any real thought to is Jacques Maritain. I think that Maritain can be interesting, but also kind of misses the point and then goes off to the proverbial races. I think that, Maritain is, an interesting guy, but he's kind of second rate. I don't think he knows the history of philosophy all that well. And I think that, he criticized Maurice Blondel on behalf of Etienne Gilson without knowing what the hell he was talking about. And that's usually a bad sign. I don't read Pieper. I don't read Kreeft. So, I mean, I've read some of them back in the day, but not enough to actually say anything interesting about them. Josh, what do you think about viewing biblical hermeneutics through a psychoanalytic lens? Which psychoanalytic lens? Psychoanalysis can mean anything you like, from crazy Reichians, doing weird, wacky stuff about the orgone and sexual energy, all the way over to, Lacan and what he's doing, and contemporary psychoanalysis, some of which is informed by, Lacan or Jung or Adler or Horney. You gotta clarify what psychoanalytic lens you mean when you say that sort of thing. Cole, I've been reading a lot of Heidegger this past week and found it surprisingly manageable due to his reputation for being difficult to read. I still can't understand Nietzsche, tricks or tips. I don't know. I don't understand or know what you don't understand about Nietzsche, or what Nietzsche works you're reading. So I don't have any tips or tricks about that. We'd have to get more specific. Rajat, how can a student find out what they like in their academic journey, whether sociology, philosophy, political science to pursue? How to know if academics is even something one should do? Okay, so read stuff in the literature. Maybe take a class here or there. Talk to people who are in those majors and see whether that's the kind of thing that you're interested in. Now, whether you should go into academics, well, it's not as if you automatically should do that unless you have a lot of disposable income and you're not particularly concerned about what you're going to do later on. And if that's the case, more power to you. I've known some people like that. I don't come from that kind of background, and most of the people that I know don't. That's not the case. If your goal is to become a university professor, this is not a particularly great time to try to do that. It is possible to get a job. You got to beat out, anywhere from 150 to 900 other applicants to get that job, which means you also have to go to graduate school and stuff like that. If your goal is to study and then apply it in some way, people in philosophy, in political science, in sociology go into a variety of other fields, right? When I was an undergraduate, systems analysis was a big thing for philosophy people. And, now there's other things, right? But you have to kind of be savvy. You can't just go through the process, do your major course of study, and then be like, all right, where's my job? You gotta plan your future a bit. So I would say that's, something that you should give some thought to. And again, talk to other people. They can give you an idea about what you might do. Tong, is there a difference between the term time and the term temporality in Heidegger's philosophy? Well, yes, one is Zeit and one is Zeitlichkeit. Temporality is, you could say, the aspects of time, right? So, Heidegger will talk about the temporality of the future. In Being and Time, for example, he talks about 4 equiprimordials. And, these are pre-understanding, mood or attunement, thrownness, and language or discourse, Rede in German. And each of these has its own temporality, right? Mood is attunement to the past, right? By the time that we're feeling a mood, we're already like rooted in the past. Pre-understanding, oriented towards the future that's coming towards us, right? Language runs and articulates through all of it. Thrownness, the present. These are temporalities. You could also call them times if you want to. Going all the way back to ancient philosophy, where they're called, Seneca talks about the 3 times, future, present, past. Augustine does as well. So, don't try to think of them, time and temporality, as being things that are separable from each other. But think of, when we're attending to temporality, we're attending to how we are in time. All right, let's see here. Gabriel, where can I find material about Seneca on hardships? I only found something in the letters to Lucilius. It depends on what you mean by hardships. All of the major treatises and the consolations are talking about things we could call hardships. The consolations are written because somebody died and people feel like crap because of it. So is death a hardship, the death of a loved one? I guess you could look at the consolations. Even things like on benefits include helping a friend out when they're facing hardships, we could say. So I don't think that it's not a topic that doesn't come up over and over again, but it depends on what you mean by hardships, right? So, all right, it looks like I'm starting to get some people with quite a few questions. I'm going to try to pick people who I haven't already done before or answered a question from. Thomas, how do you think philosophy of education applying conscientiation, that seems like a made-up term, of whiteness in light of white supremacist settler colonialism is a means for humanization, if at all, with regard to existentialism? This is almost like word salad at this point. Let's see if we can zone in on one question. Philosophy of education, applying, let's say, the concept of whiteness in light of white supremacist settler colonialism as a means for humanization. So, yeah, what people throw out there as settler, and by the way, settler colonialism can be tied in with all sorts of conceptions of races. It can be, African Americans going back to Liberia and setting up their own caste system. But colonialism, there's there's aspects that we want to be kind of careful in applying these things, so we're not just painting with too broad a brush. But you can say that one of the key aspects of colonialism. Read Frantz Fanon, for example, Black Skin, White Masks. He's got some great phenomenological analyses. Is treating other people who are human as if they're not human or as if they're subhuman. Hannah Arendt, by the way, also talks about this in the Origins of Totalitarianism, because the first part is devoted to colonialism, right? So, no vast surprise here. White supremacy, to begin with, white supremacy is just a silly thing to begin with. I'm not trivializing it. They do a lot of damage. They do a lot of harm, both to themselves and even more to other people. But this whole concept of white supremacy, you see this in questions all the time, about various races, and people are always answering these questions saying, you stupid Americans always want to view things in terms of white versus something else, and this doesn't actually fit into it. For example, ancient Greece and Rome are not white, right? Because that category isn't even around. One way you can tell that doesn't matter in terms of skin color being important, one of the examples that the Stoics give of something that's purely indifferent, that doesn't matter at all, color of one's skin, black or white, right? So, white supremacy, people thinking that whiteness is something, fundamentally good, and they're caught up in this Manichaean struggle between themselves and pick whoever else you like. It's dehumanizing. And it's also dehumanizing, as Martin Luther King pointed out, for the racists themselves, right? So, I mean, we can certainly, it doesn't have to be philosophy of education. It could be, I mentioned in the worldviews and values class, which is an intro class, we look at the letter from a Birmingham jail. We can do this in all sorts of ways. Why don't, what is standing in the way of being more human? I mean, there can be other things where differences matter, but seems to me it's kind of a weird hill that a lot of people on a lot of sides want to fight on. All right. MF, also the genocide of Native Americans nobody talks about. Who the hell's the nobody there? I've been hearing about it since I was a little kid. I mean, it's widely acknowledged. It's part of a lot of curriculums. People got to avoid these sweeping hyperbolic statements. They do zero good for any sort of real thinking about these matters. Now here's an interesting question. Could I do an AMA with Evil Sadler? And I would say in theory, yes, but I would have to find some way to, as I'm streaming, reverse the colors, right? And YouTube doesn't have stuff like that in the native streaming app that I'm using right here. And I'd want to do a voice modifier as well. So it's possible, but I would have to find some way to put it through filters to make it work. And I don't actually have the tech know-how to do that at this point in time. So, but it is kind of a cool idea. Richard Aguirre, do you think utilitarianism is compatible with Christianity? Depends on which Christianity you're talking about. I mean, you're talking about a vast tradition going back 2 millennia, and which one do you mean? Which idea do you mean? And which utilitarianism do you mean? If we're gonna do these sort of like, can this mix with this? You gotta like be more specific. About what you have in mind. I will say this, that Mill thinks of utilitarianism as bringing together some key insights from Christianity and, interestingly enough, from Stoicism. He tells you this right there in On Liberty, right? Or is it in his utilitarianism? I might be mixing up the passages in which this happens. All right. I can't read Cyrillic stuff, so I'm not sure what the name here is. Can you tell me which tradition, even though I know analytical versus continental does not apply anymore, is mostly present in the US? I know that some unis in the UK still do value their analytical tradition. Analytic philosophy is the dominant form of philosophy here in the United States. And, continental philosophy, both of them are sets of traditions. Neither one is a single tradition, right? And we're not entirely past it. So they're both there, right? James, what do you think of W.D. Ross's prima facie duties? I like him so much that I teach him every time I teach ethics, because I think it's a useful approach for people to think about. I like W.D. Ross. Paul Litter, do you have any recommendations for good quality news sources? Are there good philosophical works that can help increase media literacy? That's a good question. I mean, I'm sure there's some newer philosophical works that would help with that, but I'm not reading them because I spend most of my time reading stuff in the history of philosophy. And there's lots of good philosophical works that can help you to increase media literacy, but not in a direct way, right? So I would say that's good. Good quality news sources. Yeah. I mean, read widely, right? Stay away from like cable TV and stuff like that. Unfortunately, a lot of newspapers these days are owned by big conglomerates, so they're not particularly good. But look for local sources. Like here in Milwaukee, the best news sources Urban Milwaukee is one of them, better than the Journal Sentinel, our official paper of record. And actually, the Kenosha News is better than our Journal Sentinel because our local newspaper has become so garbage because it's owned by one of these big, publishing consortiums. It's really too bad because both there was originally two papers here in Milwaukee: the Milwaukee Journal, which leaned left, the Milwaukee Sentinel, which leaned right. They both won Pulitzers and stuff like that. Then they merged in the 1990s and became one big newspaper, and they were still doing good work, but years and years of erosion have really done them in. And this is the case in many cities here in the U.S. I mean, it's good also. I mean, if you're an American, try to get plenty of international news, and not just through, the international section in the New York Times or the Washington Post. I mean, read papers or read news sites that are actually coming out from people in other countries and see what they have to say, right? So that, and then what you're doing is you're trying to create composite pictures rather than be like, I this is my one reliable news source. This is made of clay. Does new materialism really move away from subject-oriented ontology? I don't see how it could do that. I don't know. I don't know enough about the new materialism to say. Jerome, can you explain Kant's categorical imperative formula of autonomy? Well, this is what we mean by the second formulation of the categorical imperative. Act always so as to treat humanity, not autonomy, humanity in yourself and others as a means, or as an ends, never just as a mere means. So you're supposed to respect the autonomy of other people. You're not supposed to just instrumentalize them. And you should also do the same with yourself. So, for example, Kant has an argument why you shouldn't prostitute yourself, as an example. We're getting close to the end time, and I do have an event at the top of the hour, so I got to get myself some lunch before that. I'm going to just take whatever I can. Silly, will you cover more of Martin Heidegger's work aside from your core concepts you currently have on your channel? No, I'm going to keep doing more core concepts about Heidegger. Why should I not use that formula? Let's see here. Oh, a lot of questions down here. Danny, did you hear about Oliva Blanchette passing away? I certainly did. Great loss. Somebody who I've corresponded with over the years, great Blondel scholar. Temik, are you aware of some foreign YouTubers steal your videos, literally copy your videos and just translate their language? No, I rely on YouTube to catch those sorts of things. If they're actually doing the work to translate me talking into a different language, should I do the work to try to track them down? I'm a pretty busy guy. D, I'm halfway through Seneca's letters on ethics. He's quickly become my favorite of the Stoics. I'd like to learn more about him and his world. Is there a good source I should check out? Well, you can read more of Seneca's works. And you mentioned the University of Chicago translation. Each of those has a nice introduction by the translators. Learning about his world is, in part reading other people who are from his world, like, for example, Epictetus or Musonius Rufus, right? Let's see. Oh, yeah. Okay. So here's a good question. Online person. Anything you think that Heidegger got interestingly wrong? Yeah. I mean, I think Heidegger, one of the big mistakes he makes is, even though he talks about tradition and community and stuff like that, he's got this point of view that he expresses in Being and Time, where any sort of approach to fundamental ontology that is involving an ethical perspective or a religious perspective is already stopping the inquiry at the start. And you could compare and contrast his work to that of, say, Max Scheler, who's explicitly doing a phenomenology of values. And I think Heidegger's wrong on that, and Shaler's right. And you know, I'm only one of many who's recognized that. Adrian Pepperzak, the great Dutch phenomenologist who taught at Loyola here, just to the south of us in Chicago, for decades, has brought this up as well about Heidegger. I also think that Heidegger, and again, Pepperzak has pointed this out and talked about this. I think that Heidegger's wrong to think that anxiety or angst is the fundamentally disclosive mood. I think that perhaps awe or wonder could be. I think maybe love could be as well. And again, Shaler, you know, sees this too as well. Joao asks, are you single? No, I've been married for 10 years. You know, anybody who follows me on social media sees me with my spouse, Andy Shaka. I reference her pretty frequently because we are, very close. So that's an easy one to address. What else can we hit on quickly? Here's a good one from the Unnoticeable. Any philosophical novels or stories you'd recommend? I mean, that could be an entire session. Last semester, you've probably seen some of the videos coming out from this. Last semester, I taught an entire class on Ursula K. Le Guin's Earthsea novels and short stories. And so she's definitely somebody who I think is massively important. Also, her classmate, Philip K. Dick, who I'm hoping to teach a class on this coming fall for Milwaukee Institute of Art and Design, very philosophically informed, as well as theologically and psychologically. There's lots and lots and lots of thinkers who explicitly talk about philosophy within their literary work. Dostoevsky, who we talked about earlier, has characters who make extensive philosophical arguments. Miguel de Unamuno does as well, somebody who we brought up earlier. Franz Kafka has people doing that in his books as well. But there's lots of literary figures who are influenced considerably by philosophy, sometimes in a more subterranean way, sometimes in a much more explicit way. So there's, you could take a look at my Worlds of Speculative Fiction series, which has got a lot of entries in it. You can look at the playlist and then look at the authors, and many of them are people who are bringing philosophy up, whether it's like Roger Zelazny and sort of Neoplatonism in the Amber Thing, or recently talked about Philip Pullman and his Dark Materials stuff, where there's lots of philosophical concepts being brought up. So I think there's great room for that sort of thing. All right, so we got about another minute. Who else can I take that I can answer very quickly? Okay, so Erickson has an interesting question here about Wittgenstein, which one of my clients was asking me about earlier this week. Do you think that the later Wittgenstein was correct in his philosophy of language? Kind of correct. I think that he's certainly better off than where he was in the Tractatus, which is, even by Wittgenstein's own admission, completely off base, except for certain kinds of language. And I think that had Wittgenstein actually read much more widely, he would have been a vastly better philosopher, and he would have generated a vastly more adequate philosophy of language. I actually, tried to write my master's thesis on Wittgenstein with a major Wittgenstein scholar, and couldn't get her to understand why I was so interested in the notion of language games as being something that could be figured within language games and how that could work. And, I think part of the problem was just the conceptual apparatus was not adequate. Wittgenstein was living in a century in which people were incredibly interested in language, and an entire revolution took place within semiotics that he was totally unaware of, as far as we can tell. So there's some cool stuff in there, and like philosophical investigations or remarks on the foundations of mathematics, the blue and brown books, uncertainty, just to name a few of the things you might go to. But it's always, you see him doing a lot of work to arrive at a few solid insights, and he could have done so much more. So that's a good place to end, I think. And I'll see all of you in some of the other online events we got coming up this month. Heavy metal class. We're talking about parody and metal. We're doing the parable of the talents and parable of the sower by Octavia Butler for the Worlds of Speculative Fiction. We've got a bunch of other things going on as well. So, all right. Thanks, everybody. Good time here, and I'm going to get some lunch. Hope all of you are doing well wherever you're located. So good night to some of you, good morning to some of you, good afternoon to some of you, and I'll catch you somewhere else in the ether.